Welcome to the Equity Institute's podcast on the purpose of public education with me, Vincent Perez. Today, we'll be talking with Courtney Daikos. I've had the privilege of serving with Courtney for 4 years with a continual consulting group on trauma-informed MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support. Courtney is sharp, intelligent, a systems thinker, and a mentor. I'm extremely grateful for the collaboration I've had the opportunity to share in with Courtney and really taking in her service, care for students, and educators. Please welcome Courtney Daikos. Courtney, thank you so much for being on our podcast about the purpose of public education. For our listeners, could you tell us a little bit about who you are and your connection to public ed?
Sure. Thank you so much, Vincent, for inviting me to be a part of this important conversation. So my name is Courtney Daikos, and my connection to public education, I feel like my whole life story is connected to public education. I talk about this a lot. I was really fortunate for my own K-12 experience to be a part of phenomenal education, both in Chicago public schools and in Oak Park, Illinois. And I had a really interesting experience because I was always kind of moved into accelerated programs and felt really challenged academically throughout my K-12 experience. My brother was born with a disability when I was 5. And so by the time I hit later elementary, he was starting his own experience in school. And it was very different to see him work through what special education looked like. And I got pretty passionate as a teenager to be involved in his education, as well as I was really active in performing arts where we ran summer camps that included kids. So I think I started being involved as a volunteer or as sort of a camp counselor, teacher by the time I was like 16. And then when I was at the University of Illinois for my undergrad, I ended up there was a work study program that President Clinton had started called America Reads. And so I was able to volunteer in classrooms in Urbana, Illinois, and teach kindergartners reading. Well, really just read to kindergartners, which is just fun, right? And it was then that I realized that I wanted to study education. Definitely connected, I think, as a sibling and then as a student. And then once I was actually in the College of Ed at the University of Illinois, I remember realizing how unique my own K-12 experience had been because we were being taught a lot of progressive ways to think about project-based learning, inquiry-based learning, really hands-on focused learning. And my own K-12 experience had never been worksheet driven. It was actually not very much textbook driven. It was very thematic. It was very hands-on. We would learn about a period of Chinese history or a specific architect in Chicago, and we would spend like weeks just studying that particular area. It was all of our math and science and everything we were learning. And so that way of learning was so authentic to me. And I realized in my ed program that everyone else in my cohort couldn't really even envision what our professors were teaching us because that wasn't how they learned. So I think my own recognition of the gaps in public education started before I was done being trained as a public educator. And then I've been involved in education ever since I was done with undergrad 20 years ago. And so, I don't know, I'm old. I'll say more, but I feel like what still drives me as an educator now is knowing how great classroom experiences and learning can be and how often what I'm observing in schools is not yet that for kids. And so I think that's something that drives me. I don't know if that's what you're asking, but.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting that you had this, sounds like very powerful, positive experience. And then, as someone who's recognized for your talents and inclinations and supported, and then having a sibling in special education, like they're two polar kind of tracks, if you will.
Absolutely.
So after undergrad, you went to teach, and then?
I did. So it took me 5 years to finish because I changed my major, but I was fortunate that while I was studying at the University of Illinois and I was in my last year, my student internship, my student teaching year, I had the opportunity to move home to Chicago and student teach in Chicago public schools. So I did my student teaching in Chicago public schools, and then I started my career as a teacher, not in the same school, but in Chicago public schools. And so I taught second grade and this is I'm sure you've heard me tell this before, but the school where I was hired had 1,000 students K-5, and every single one of them was either born in Mexico or born to Mexican-American parents in Chicago. But most of the, kids, a studio apartment, 10, 11 family members living in that apartment. We didn't have a playground. We didn't have recess because there were so many kids that there was a huge modular portable building where the playground should have been. And so I remember teaching my second graders, and after lunch wishing I could take them to recess. And by the way, what a crime that they don't have recess, right? Like we can have a whole nother conversation about who does and doesn't get access to physical play. But yeah, so I taught there for a year, and then I was one of the only people hired that wasn't fully bilingual, and they were downsizing, and I could have taken on a temporary job, but instead I changed locations to a different school and moved into more of a literacy coaching role before I relocated to Seattle in 2004. So I taught for 3 years in Chicago public schools before I was hired to be a reading specialist here in Seattle. And then eventually I went back to grad school and got my administrative credentials. And then I started to become an administrator in Highline Public Schools. And I was there for 9 years in the central office as a high school assistant principal and as an elementary principal.
Thank you. So with that experience, and also as now a consultant in trauma-informed MTSS, I know you've been doing that for some years.
Yeah.
Grateful to do that with you. I appreciate that time spent for my own career and learning from you and Chris. So just a lot of gratitude there. But I'm curious with that, kind of, almost lifetime, vast experience thinking about what this thing is that we call education.
Yep.
What is the purpose of public education?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is critical thinking. There's a few things. Critical thinking, community. I'm thinking I've got these C's going on. We're talking a lot right now about connectedness as prevention. And I think it is one of the main functions that public schools serve, is that it is a place for us to grow and develop when we're students, our social skills, our understanding of our community, our ways to solve problems with each other. And it's interesting because as I was thinking about what the purpose is, I also feel like some of those are the things that are the most in danger or not really being maintained by the public education system. And so I'm concerned, to be honest, that I think public education plays a role that, depending on what state you're in right now, or even what location, I know there are many places where we're not realizing that potential or even that purpose. And I worry about how I feel like the economy is relying schools more and more as a purpose to be babysitting. And so I don't know. I said a lot of things, but it's almost like I feel like in my mind, what can it be? What was it for me? What is it that I know that it should be for all kids? As well as what is it really not right now? How has it been twisted and manipulated? And why are so many families leaving? So yeah, I have lots of thoughts about the purpose and the potential, as well as the potential misuse, if that makes sense.
I appreciate even the interpretation of the question, right? Because it's a big question, and there are many angles in what should it be? What is it? What can it be? All those frames that you ask. In terms of what you've actually seen work, are there models, philosophies, approaches in practice or policy that get to that connectedness or get to that community and that personal development and social development of young people?
So yes, absolutely. And again, I go back to my own experience, as well as schools that I've been fortunate to either support as a consultant or work in myself. I think, first of all, going back to what I was describing about the richness of my own experience that I was having 40, 30 years ago, and then what I was learning to try and replicate as an educator 20 plus years ago. I think that any learning that really is grounded in something tangible, something relevant, something meaningful, when we think about purpose, this in our teaching to teachers, that we're always making sure that they're really clear on the purpose of whatever it is they're teaching, their own purpose of what they're teaching. But I think it often gets lost for kids. And so where I feel like it works really well is where, students have some ownership and some input around everything, the environment, the relationships, the agreements, as well as the content, the learning, the application for future. And so I've certainly seen pockets of that throughout my career. In terms of systems that really bring that to fruition, it's so hard because as I start to think of certain ones, they're complex issues. Like I could talk about, there's great things about the Montessori approach, for example, but that's typically a pretty expensive private approach. That's usually mostly for white kids that have access to it, right? So not a great model to just all of a sudden replicate in terms of its cost. But I think, schools that just feel good. Like it's interesting, this year we're working with a school district. And for the first time, I thought of you, Vince, one of the middle schools you and I observed years ago. And we walked out and I remember you saying, like, I just feel depressed because it was based You remember exactly what
Remember
I'm
that
talking
feeling.
about, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you feel that way when you're in a school where there's no life and there's no passion and they're just basically crowd controlling kids. It's so painful to sit through those classes, even for 10 minutes. And you just feel for those kids because they're bored out of their minds and the teachers aren't engaged. And I hate to generalize that that's happening in a lot of places, but unfortunately, as we've traveled to more and more school districts that are not in the urban centers, I feel like it's more likely that especially in middle and high school, find those dynamics. And I had the privilege of being in a middle school this spring where it just felt different. And it was June, by the way, which is like not really the best time to observe a school, right? Like the posters are off the wall, the testing is done, it's field day and movies typically, and not a lot of rigor, right? Well, in this particular middle school, it was just so apparent that the educators, first of all, communicate with each other and they're on the same page about some common language of how they approach kids, which we know is huge. It's one of the best ways to, again, start to infuse that connectedness because kids are looking to us to figure out, am I safe? And if adults are on the same page, that's a pretty significant message that, okay, I'm safe here. These adults all seem to know what's going on and it's positive. But I really felt like it was evident to me in their classrooms that they saw themselves not just as experts of their content, but really as cultivators of kids having transferable skills. Right. So getting them to reflect at the end of a lesson on, was I a good digital citizen with my computer during this lesson? Did I talk to my partner? Did I get my work done? Those are simple questions to ask. But when adults ask kids that question at the end of every lesson, it signals, hey, we're asking you to be accountable for these things. Give yourself an evaluation real quick, but also these are the skills that matter for you. And so I think about those kinds of environments. And this is a middle school that we're continuing to work with. They still have some things to fix. And yet engaging with those teachers this summer, as soon as we started leaning into data, some harsh data, to be honest, about their own discipline practices, they were hungry for that kind of learning and there wasn't any pushback. And I think, as you know, like it's not always the case in a secondary setting that you get those feelings of these are educators that really see themselves as, again, sort of growing minds and capacity versus this is my content and you need to learn what I think is important, right?
See the component of curiosity, which to me is kind of foundational to exploratory, emancipatory, liberating education.
Yeah.
Both in the students, kind of back to John Dewey, like do reflect. So
Right.
if the students are reflecting on the doing that they had just done, and the teacher's taking this data and are reflecting on with the meaning of that, and then it's in that continuous cycle, that's the process of learning. How do systems do that? I've been thinking about schools as learning organizations and posing the question, why aren't schools learning organizations for some? Right.
Yeah. Especially, and I mean, we've had this conversation before as well. Like we have not built schools to be focused on the adults as learners. Right? Like we've talked about when you go to teach a staff, it's very often that they're crammed into a library that was really built for little kids and not for them. So we don't always think of organizations as learning organizations, like you're saying. And we don't really structure the instructional day to respect the learning needs of educators. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier. And this was a huge frustration I had when we pivoted from hybrid to full back in-person instruction 2 years ago. It really didn't seem to be based on what was best for kids or teachers. It was based on the fact that parents need kids to be employed by school for 7 hours. I feel like that's what drives so many of the decisions and the whole infrastructure. I mean, our infrastructure is over 200 years old. It's such an outdated model. And we see families now, I mean, every school district that we work with has less enrollment now than it did before. Families are leaving.
Yeah.
And for all kinds of legitimate reasons that we're talking about. I don't think that families see the purpose of education the way that it should be, right? And or there's lots of, we could have a whole conversation about the politics of why especially certain families are moving in a certain direction away towards homeschooling and parents' rights. But, just back to that again, I feel like there are many mechanisms of the institution that are broken and really old. And I don't know that the conversation outside of educators and families at the policy level is really inclusive of these considerations. And I'm concerned because teachers, principals, superintendents are leaving. And yeah, so I know I'm bringing up a big issue, but
well, can you identify some more of the challenges? I mean, even what you name in terms of the structure, I'm working with a superintendent who's the kind of folks I think we need in these positions, who's saying we have to blow up the 6-period school day. What are we doing on this model that like silos knowledge
Yep.
when we know in a project-based approach, like it's interdisciplinary, right?
Mhm.
Where the application, the relevance is interdisciplinary. And so he says, if I got a teacher that's been teaching for 20, 25 years and say, hey, we're going to blow up the 6-period day, they don't have a mental model for that. There's no like to adjust. So how do we over time think about this shift?
Yep.
Competency-based learning,
Yes.
and just how do students show what they know?
Yeah.
And saying, yeah, I can do that skill. And it's everything for me from like running a chainsaw to that math formula, right? How do we show what we know? So I'm curious, identifying some of these structural issues, and then how do we respond?
Right. So yeah, I'm real good at telling you what the problem is. I'm like, I wish I had a whiteboard. I want to start like drawing all these issues. But one of the issues that I think especially if you haven't sat at the budgeting table of a school district, I think it's very hard for people to really understand two massive infrastructural ways in which we build and run and fund schools. So the first one being the per pupil expenditure, that literally every child who walks through the door is worth somewhere between about $10,000 and $20,000 from the state, depending on what state you're in. And then additional local funds get on top of that. But let's just call it like 14 grand. It's a good average probably of how much each student, as soon as they're enrolled, those dollars are now flowing from the state into that school district for that year. Well, that alone is, so having sat in the principal's chair where you have an enrollment for your school year and you have to determine how many kids are going to be at each grade in each class, how many teachers are teaching what, it's all a mathematical formula. And you get to the point literally where one student buys you a whole nother teacher or not, because of, again, it's this average that's been created of how many kids are there. This is why in elementary schools you end up with split grade classes, which can be both a good and a bad thing. But regardless, I think that this piece alone, that every student is worth dollars, and therefore every student that either enrolls or not significantly changes the funding of that system and how many resources they have to work with. That's one issue that I think is pretty massive. Another issue that's kind of embedded in what you were just naming in terms of the fact that in a high school, we need to have these 6 periods of different content. Well, in Washington State, those kids after 4 years have to have 24 credits, right? So we've designed a 6-period day so that student in each of those 4 years of high school gets a credit of math and a credit of language arts and a credit of science and a credit of social studies and a credit usually of physical education or health, and then some sort of elective credit and across the course of that time. Well, again, having run a high school, and this is probably part of why the superintendent wants to make that change, that becomes really high stakes if once a kid fails even just one of those courses, now they're off on that track to be able to graduate. So now they've got to repeat that course, right? And so that alone, that matriculating of separate kinds of credits was well intended, right? We want to graduate kids that know those things. So that's well intended, but it's so regimented and institutionalized and segmented and siloed that it really makes it a challenge to do what that superintendent is trying to do, and is a big part of why kids leave during high school, because they don't feel connected to it. They don't feel like it's relevant, and they stop attending, the kids that we're most concerned about. But I think another layer that relates to that idea of these sort of separate lanes of content and therefore credit is also an infrastructural issue, because we have the federal government that funds massive separate chains of dollars and compliance that every school district is responsible for paying for. And I do have a solution in mind that I'll mention in a second. So what that means is, if I'm Seattle Public Schools and I have over 100,000 students, then I'm bringing in all that FTE for all of those kids. And the fact that I need a department just for CTE, which is career and technical education, which has a ton of compliance around it. And it's great because kids learn real skills in high school that get them into careers, right? But if you're overseeing that for a school district, typically in a place like Seattle, you have an entire administrator just for that, because there's so much to keep track of in terms of making sure that every high school is meeting the compliance and the teachers are all trained correctly and the credits are flowing correctly and the dollars are going to the right courses, right? That's one federal source. Then you've got other federal sources. You've got special education, which is a whole nother set of federal dollars and compliances, right? Then you've got Title I dollars, which are meant to support students that are living in poverty, but most school districts access some of it, and they got to oversee all that. That's what I did when I was in Highline in the central office for 3 years was manage about $40 million of that kind of federal money. And there's a ton of work to stay in compliance just with that funding stream. Then you've got Title III funding, which is for ELL students. And right now, I'm just talking about federal dollars. Once you get to the state level, you've got other lanes of very specific dollars that the legislature has allocated that has to go to these kids, and you have to document which kids in which ways. And you can literally just go dizzy, start just naming funding streams and layers of compliance for managing those funding streams that are so siloed. And so again, I go back to my analogy. If Seattle Public Schools has to manage all that, well, they can afford to put an administrator and a team in charge of each of those funding streams. And it's their job to go bug a principal about, have you done this piece? Have you done this piece? Are all these happening? Well, when you are a school district of less than 2,000 students, you still have to manage all of those different, the dollars are smaller, but the compliance isn't gone. You've still got to manage all the things that CTE wants you to do, all the things that special ed wants you to do. And typically in a school district that small, if I'm the central office administrator overseeing that money, I'm overseeing all of it. So like, I don't know how people do that job. I used to work alongside those people and I would feel for them because it's impossible to do all of that work. And so one of the solutions that I think could be really revolutionary, even in our state, and people, I will not be popular with small school districts when they hear me say this, but what if we, for example, were to take the resources of a county versus individual municipalities and say that the oversight of CTE, special ed, all of these things is county managed, and you wouldn't need a school board and a superintendent in every school district. Again, I know I'm not going to be popular with those people when I say this, but the reality is we see this all the time. And I know you know this because you work with a lot of smaller districts as well. It is nearly impossible for a small size school district to actually keep up with all of that compliance, let alone do really quality work for their kids. I mean, I can name multiple districts and I won't because I'm not going to throw them under the bus, but there are multiple school districts that I know of that unless we help them as a consultant, they're not even looking at their own data. They have no one in-house that is capturing that data. They don't know how to help their teachers access that data. Like the level of lack, the vacuum or void of very basic infrastructure for school districts that exist in small systems, again, I think is such a symptom of the fact that we expect every single place to have their own way of doing things rather than concentrating resources in such a way that would be so much better for the educators and for the students. Because again, I'm always in my mind comparing what these big urban districts are capable of doing versus what these tiny ones literally don't have the manpower, let alone the knowledge base to do. And so I know I kind of went on a bird walk around that, but I feel like those are two massive, again, really old components of how we run schools that no one on a national level is talking about unpacking. And I know why. We have all these other issues to solve right now, but I don't know how we start to change the outcomes in education without looking at these pretty big barriers around how we fund and staff and resource, if that makes sense.
So you're kind of really, it's back to infrastructure and what are the mechanisms. I don't know. There's really something here that broadens out and says, okay, parents expect we need the kids to go somewhere.
Right.
Well, I go to my job. Right? Yes. We hope they're getting a great education and things.
Right. And they're safe.
It's depending on where your geography matters.
Huge.
I'm curious then about what are the policy solutions. This may be a whole nother podcast around. Yeah. Okay, really exploring this kind of innovative thinking, but I think we are here, right? This is time post-COVID, rubber band back to status quo.
Yep.
It doesn't work for a lot of students.
Yep.
What did we learn from this experience of remote learning? We're not taking lessons from it. It's just back to status quo.
At all.
So this leads me to just a whole series of questions about policies.
Yeah,
right? and policies for innovation.
Yes, we need them desperately. And I said this before we got on the call, but I'll say this again for your audience that's within Washington State. I think one of the best policies that we could change would be to institute an income tax. And I know that's really unpopular. It's actually, I think it's in our Constitution that we won't have an income tax. So it would mean a constitutional change. But we're denying our students resources so much that if you look at, when you compare even just the state infrastructure for teacher learning, if you go look at a place like Massachusetts that has a significant income tax and significant infrastructure for their teachers. If you're a teacher in the state of Massachusetts, you can log on to their state website and you can take college quality coursework throughout the school year to help you grow as an educator. It's all run by the state. We don't have anything like that here. And when I think about all of the unfunded mandates, right? Like that's constant. is school districts, yet again, now we got to do this, we got to do this, we got to do this. Nothing's happening very well because it's constantly something new and there's never resources to go alongside it. And so I feel like in our state, so I recently learned, we know that mental health is such a massive need. And we know that even when we have a family or a youth that's willing to accept mental health care, they're often on a waiting list for 18 months to get in to see anyone locally, right? Like we don't have enough clinicians, professionals, psychologists, social workers, people that can do that work, who have evidence-based strategies to help kids with their mental health. So we need to produce more of those people, but we also need more resources to be able to fund that work. And most other states that have an income tax are able through Medicaid match to get whatever they put in matched by the feds. So they double those resources specific to mental health. And we're not getting access to any of that because we don't have the infrastructure of an income tax. And that just blows my mind. Like it feels to me like of everything else we've just named that are big institutional things to change. And maybe I'm naive about how stuck people are on not having an income tax, but I feel like we could change that as a state faster. Then we could maybe come up with this innovative way that you're describing of like, how do we totally rethink high school, for example, so kids don't have to be stuck in separate 50-minute courses a day. I believe we could do it, but it'd be a lot to figure that out. It's breaking a lot of things that a lot of people put a lot of energy into, like the fact that we now have 24 credits. That alone was a big project for several years to whittle down and agree on what those credits are. And so, yeah, I'm on a state income tax soapbox these days. To anyone that'll let me talk about it.
Well, really money, right? We're back to funding. So when I think about these policies for innovation, it's really innovative policies for funding.
Yeah, some of it has to be, because the barriers to the funding are part of the problem.
Yeah.
Right. Those silos I talked about, and never shall this dollar support this kind of work. It can only support this kind of work. And you end up, this was what I did when I was in charge of these monies for Highline. You end up getting a little creative about what you call things because you got to pay for this thing out of this bucket. And as long as it has this keyword in it, or it's right, that's not how you should be doing things, but it's what you do to make sure that you're in compliance,
Just to note, I was contacted a few weeks ago before the due date that said, we have $3 million to spend. It all has to be allocated by the 1st. And I was just like, well, I could support with student programming for maybe 50,000 of it.
Yeah.
Good luck. Like, what is happening?
And that's that's a whole nother issue about monies that expire, which I still don't understand that. Like the money just disappears if it's not spent. No, right? But that happens all the time. And it happens where, this is a massive issue at the post-secondary level as well, in terms of what kind of research is going on, right? Because it's not typically like, oh, let's think outside of the box and fund what needs to be solved. Typically, it's more like, oh, we want to fund this. Could you research this problem that we're trying to fund, right? And so then you're like trying to fit your research around what they want to pay for or the timeline that you're talking about. Yeah, I don't know. I'm sorry, I'm living big level, but I really feel like I don't know how we're going to change education without being at that level of the conversation.
As an educator, my first question is, what are the right questions? And I feel like this conversation is leading me to those questions even. What do we even need to be looking at and questioning structurally that are going to solve the problems? It's and thinking about the funding versus the practice, right? So there's a whole bunch of talk and work that I am swimming in around practice.
Totally.
But the infrastructural funding component is first. It comes first.
It is, which is, even going back to when you were naming your superintendent, you're supporting that wants to think outside of that 6-period day, which I'm like, please hold on to that. Like, yes, we need to think outside of that. And there's so many rigid infrastructural rules around the fact that, again, you gain these credits, you have this many hours. And it reminds me as well of, again, I know you see this, teachers are beyond exhausted. Like we talked about this, the fact that pretty much every other educated profession is just now threatening to go back to work full time, literally. That's what's happening, right? But teachers had no choice. It was just bam. And there were all of these things we could have learned from the pandemic in terms of hybrid learning, in terms of how kids had more voice via technology. There's a lot of shy kids that would rather message their teacher, I don't understand, than raise their hand in class. And there were so many of those nuggets that came out of it. There were high school kids who were like, I can get all this work done in 2.5 hours and I don't have to waste 6.5 hours being in person. Why? And then you wonder why those kids are now choosing Running Start, or they're just, again, they're opting out because they're like, no, I had a flavor of how this was worked better for me. And so I come back to, like, when you're talking about practice, the amount of time that a teacher teaches every day versus the very little time that they're given to prepare and grade and study and collaborate and learn. As you said earlier, learn. I mean, we know this because we're in the profession of teaching teachers. Even the most highly engaged teachers right now are it is very challenging to teach them because they're so exhausted and overwhelmed. They don't remember what you've taught them, even if they valued it. And I see this constantly with administrators and teachers. And so another, again, infrastructural thing we need to think about is, why do we need teachers to teach for that many hours a day? Couldn't we think differently about the resources? If we look at Scandinavian schools and everyone loves to celebrate how much healthier their kids are and happier their teachers are, well, you know why? Because they teach about half as much of the day as we do. And the kids have unstructured really play and exploring. And then the teachers have half the day every day to be able to plan, grade, learn, collaborate. And so I feel like that issue of us expecting both kids and adults to be at school for too many hours a day, and this idea that every kid is worth a certain amount of money and those monies have to be spent, like all of those layers of infrastructure, I feel like unless we start talking about them openly, we're going to keep spinning our wheels with these other symptoms of those structures.
So I'm walking away, the big themes, money and time.
I wish it wasn't, but here we are in capitalist America.
So you're naming some large things. So I'm curious then, for anybody listening to this, like, do you have any particular calls to action that may be, kind of like doable in terms of, well, this sounds like a great conversation, but it sounds really overwhelming. What can I do?
Right. I think that I'm going to say again, if you are a Washington State resident, start having a conversation with your friends and colleagues and leaders in your community about a state income tax. I can't stress more highly how much we would benefit as a state if we had that infrastructure. So that's the first thing that just comes to mind, because I feel like it's something we all need to start talking to each other about and helping, because people don't realize that we're turning away about $1 billion of Medicaid match every year in mental health funding alone. Everyone loves to talk about and kind of admire the problem that we've got massive mental health issues, because we do. And so I think that's the first thing I would say. In terms of more tangible things, we really haven't talked about practice much at all. I know I've been very focused on the infrastructure, and I'm super passionate about practice, and we could have a whole nother hour just talking about pedagogy and ways to connect with kids. But I think something that's really clear on my mind, we've helped a lot of high schools in the last year respond to suicide. And when you look at the literature from the CDC and the NIH and what we know about kids feeling connected to school is the most important thing that we could do. And so for anyone listening that is in a secondary learning environment, well, any learning environment, number one, making sure that kids feel connected, especially girls, especially students of color, especially students that don't identify on the traditional gender binary. We know that group of students, you can look at the national data, you can look at local data. That's who we are the most concerned about. Those are the kids who most likely say they don't feel connected to school. And they're the kids who are most likely to engage in risky self-harm or even suicidal kinds of behavior. And so everyone talks about belonging, right? It's kind of the buzz phrase right now. But I don't know if a lot of folks are really breaking down what does that really mean for our interactions with kids, and how do we as a community foster the belonging? And so in terms of a tangible next step, I think one of the most powerful things you can do as a school is figure out who are the students and families that don't yet feel like they belong, and start asking them questions about what are we doing unintentionally to make you feel that disconnected? How are we not showing up for you? And what would it look like if we showed up better for you? How would you want to be greeted by us? What kinds of things do you want to be engaged in? And there are so many amazing solutions that come from youth, and they're often not that complicated. But I don't know that we're always curious as an institution to engage them around what those issues really are and what needs to happen to solve them. And so we know that a caring adult in a child's life is huge at any age. We also know that their peer-to-peer relationships are really huge. And we know that even prior to the pandemic, their ability to have in-person practice with social everything, when it goes wrong, when it goes right, we know they were already lacking in terms of literally thousands of hours of practice that most of us had, because we didn't have devices when we were growing up. We had to interact with each other socially. We had television, but that is not the same thing as social media and cell phones, right? And so we know that our kids were already under practiced with their social skills. And then the pandemic really forced everyone to be in isolation and further be isolated and further have that detriment or that lack of exposure and experience. And so I know teachers are often talking about, wow, these students seem much younger. Well, they are right now. The kids that survived the pandemic, especially those that were at the pivotal transition moments. So the cohort of kids that were supposed to start kindergarten or sixth grade in middle school or ninth grade in high school or even university. We have literally there's metadata. This is a national conversation at this point. Those groups of students are significantly behind because they couldn't get access to that transitional experience that they needed. They can grow, they can learn, but we all need to be recognizing that they're behind in that practice and provide more of that practice. And so I do feel like there are tangible next steps you can take with the kids, especially getting curious about the ones that are not seeming to engage or speak up and figuring out how do you engage them with enough trust for them to actually share with you what some of those barriers are.
And respond.
And sometimes that takes a lot of trust building, as you know. It might take a whole year, but it's worth it because these are our lives that we've got to focus
Well, Courtney, I really appreciate your perspective. I'm so grateful that you made time, and this conversation is going to sit with me for some time. I can feel it. Thank you. This was a real joy.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you for all the things that you continue to do for our community and our kids. So I'm glad I can still call you a colleague and get to have these opportunities to connect with you.